Here, just a second. Welcome to the Brazil Seminar. This series of lectures are part of the Political, Social, and Economic Development in Brazil course offered by the School of International Public Affairs with support from the Institute of Latin American Studies and the Lehman Center for Brazilian Studies at Columbia University. Over the years, we have had speakers from a broad range of areas, including leading academics, current and former senior government officials, representatives of international organizations, and Wall Street analysts, among other distinguished guests. Even though the discussions are tailored to graduate students in international affairs, public policy, and Latin American studies, the lectures should be accessible to anyone interested in Brazil. Following a tradition set forth by Professor Albert Fischlow, who launched the Brazil Seminar almost 20 years ago, we aim to continue offering a unique academic experience to students while enabling the participation of the community, now with the use of new technologies. Thanks for joining us and enjoy the session. Thanks, Anna. I'm gonna stop sharing here for a minute so we can get started with our productions. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the last open session of the semester. So the students already feel that they are missing the seminar. We still have one class to go, but it's also a great pleasure for us to finish or to end the semester on a very high note. We have a few guests here today. They are professors that have been attending our classes and they have spoken here. So they're going to be around on campus. I hope that I have a chance to talk to them at some point. And it looks like there's some music in the background.
Yes.
Right.
That's my favorite song.
Professor, exactly. It's part of your soundtrack.
It's the walk-up song.
We're preparing the spirit for our very entertaining discussion. I think I know what happened.
I think I can find it.
Right.
Yeah.
I would guess.
I don't know. I don't have any alerted about that when you stop it, and then there's an advertisement that continues rolling on. All right. Oh, pretty good. One of the things that I like the most, whenever a professional teacher is around, is to embarrass him. I used to do that as a student, and I continue to do that now that I'm on the other side. And the reason is that, Professor, I have to apologize in advance because every generation rediscovers you in a different fashion. So we have to make the introductions, and we have thanks to Michelle. And we have to provide some background so that the students not only appreciate what you've done on the intellectual side, but also how much you've contributed to the study of Brazil, how much you've contributed to the creation of several institutions that have impacted Brazil in many ways. All right, so Professor Fischlow, bear with me for a couple of moments. And one of the things that when you read Professor Fischlow's long resume is that how academically he has progressed over time. He started at Penn as an undergrad, went to Harvard, got an upgrade and moved to the West Coast and started teaching at Berkeley. Spent 22 years on the West Coast, came to the East Coast again, taught at Yale, and luckily for us, at the pinnacle of his academic profession, academic career, he came to Columbia and created what now is the Center for Brazilian Studies. We are all here because of Professor Fischlow's contribution to our academic life here on campus. So it's a great pleasure for us to have Professor Fischlow here. I mean, in parallel to his work in several universities, Professor Fischlow was also the founder and first president of the Latin America LACEA, which is the Latin American and Caribbean Economic Association, regarded as the most successful society for economic research in the developing world. Professor Fischl was awarded the National Order of the Southern Cross by the Republic of Brazil, and that's the Brazil's highest honor. And last year, we were very pleased when Harvard announced Professor Fischl as one of the honorees with Harvard's Centennial Medal. And I'm just gonna read a couple of lines that were part of an announcement, so that the students can have an understanding of the magnitude of that award. So Professor Fischl was awarded the Centennial Medal for his intellectual leadership in the field of Brazilian economics, for his commendable success in strengthening Latin American institutions and international partnerships, and for the great magnitude of his influence as a mentor to generations of scholars and world leaders. President Fernando Henrique Cardoso described Professor Fischl as the informal dean of international Brazilianists. And among some of his most prominent students was a former Minister of Finance, Pedro Malone, who says that his former students, most of them turned friends, recognize a remarkable human quality of Professor Fischl, which have, through their own teaching and research, helped to improve the quality of public policy debate in many fields in which he has labored, including them, you here, where I had the chance to hear from Professor Fischl firsthand. So Professor Fischl, welcome back in the classroom. So good to have you in person joining us tonight.
Yes, well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. I hate to think that somehow or another you expected someone younger and more active and vigorous than I, but I do try to keep in touch with what's going on still in Brazil and in the United States. Indeed, I have the intent of putting together a little book of the essays I wrote for the Estado de Sao Paulo, in which in recent years I frequently compared President Trump and President Bolsonaro. And I enjoyed that sufficiently that I thought it was worth doing. Now, you don't have, those aren't going to be distributed?
Later on, online.
Oh, okay. Can I have them so I can see them?
Yes.
Thank you. He was just testing to see whether I could remember without problem, you see, everything that I have written here. These are three parts of what is going on. One was written in 2013, which is a piece that has the statue of Christ on the pedestal of the mountain overlooking the Atlantic. And I called it Still There, simply because The Economist had started its series earlier and showed the statue taking off as a result of Brazil's great growth rates, and everything was resolved for the future and wouldn't have a problem. And then later on, when growth began to slow, they showed the statue descending and in accordance with what was happening to the growth rate. And I wrote this piece, and as I said, The Economist gets it wrong twice in a row. The first time around, they assumed that Brazil was angelic. It was growing 7.5% a year and having all of these expanding education, commitment to democracy, buoyant industry, improving income distribution, new middle class, energetic foreign policy. You couldn't ask for more. And when it was descending, like Orpheus to Hades, the average growth rate in 2011 to 13 was less than 2% a year with high inflation. It was also a politics and economics of corruption that occurred at that time. And it was a society of increasing violence that was happening that had not been characteristic earlier. And it was seemingly indeed against the West. Neither version is correct. But interestingly, what you in fact see is that you have a series of circumstances in politics where you have too many political parties, over 30 at that point, and I think currently the number is 37, but it's hard from one day to the next to know who started up a new party in Brazil. With the Congress that is non-functional, reliance on a technocracy, rule by medida provisoria, which are executive actions which are taken, and only over time has there been some structuring in which the Congress has to ratify it rather than the executive to publish it. And you have a political structure that operates and is very much oriented along individual state lines. You know what the state will do because of where it is and which party is heading it, and by the children of the previous generation who manage always to acquire additional rights over time as the successors, so that even rules limiting the number of terms don't make any difference in that respect. The change in other respects, and I'll try to go over it more rapidly, leaving a little bit more for the future, is in the economics of the matter. Investment in Brazil is always too low. Brazil is the only country that has not managed to find some way or another to generate larger domestic savings. Brazil is one of the few societies which is like the United States, where consumerism and different brands of cars and different styles are the things that count, rather than a single car that would be produced relatively inexpensively and everyone would have it and there would not be that kind of circumstance. Foreign investment has its limits, and those limits always get set by the amount of consumption that gets done in order to have some kind of participation of domestic companies and foreign companies. The Brazil of the period is one that always gave attention to manufacturers. Manufacturers were what counted in Brazil. It's quite interesting that you have a Brazilian institution in Brapa that gets developed later, but the focus on Brazil and the difference in many ways between the parties comes down to what subsidies will be granted to manufacturing enterprises, because that's what counts. The notion of social policies in Brazil is also interesting. Brazil needs better rather than more social expenditure. The reason you have social expenditure being relatively high, as in the area of education, is because of the fact that education in Brazil had very large free education at the university level, but very poor education at the primary and secondary level. And you never had an articulation that is like. The other thing that Brazil has that developed over time as well is a social security system that was very generous in terms of the minimum wage for those workers who were formal workers rather than those who were working at various places, selling a variety of small things cheaply and the like. You had that, and you also have large regional inequality that has to be taken into account. Now, the interesting point about all of this is I wrote this 10 years ago. And yet, if I were to publish it in Brazil tomorrow, people would think I'm talking about what's going on. That's not because I'm smart. That's because Brazil has a reluctance to change. In a curious way, Brazil is seeking to repeat the classic case of Argentina. Argentina was a country that stood at the beginning of the 20th century as number 8 in per capita income in the world. Today, Argentina's per capita income, or at the time that this had been the case, it's now 68th, which gives you some idea of what it means to not deal with the problems. The middle income trap may become as real as the futile dreams of the Brazilian miracle. That's number one. Number two was written in December of 2018, which was an attempt to characterize the new Bolsonaro government, in which I call it a division of labor. It was his concept of the specialization which he saw as possible among the allies that he would have. The role of the executive, which was Bolsonaro, who never failed to emphasize that he was the chief in charge with his close family around him. To end violence, distribute guns to everybody on the grounds that guns that everybody has are very useful because you can kill your enemy, and that makes life much easier, less discussion that you have to hear. He also brought the military into the government in a way that was almost greater than the military dictatorship which was established in 1964. Believe it or not, there were more military people in charge of obligation during the Bolsonaro period than there were in the earlier period. And yet, there's also a third side to what Bolsonaro wanted, which was to create a new populism. And in this regard, I make the comparison between Bolsonaro and Trump, because in many ways, the two of them managed to find how to create an incompetent administrative government, but at the same time, to get what they wanted personally. And in economics, it was concentrating power in the hands of Paulo Guedes, who wanted capitalization and gradual reduction of the pending deficit in the Social Security system, neither of which were true. He missed out on both. He wanted a monetary policy that would have, as Milton Friedman had earlier proclaimed, a constant rate of change of the money supply. In international trade, high tariffs. Petrobras was a nationalistic strategy with large fuel subsidies that would be granted when the market wasn't helpful to Brazil. The states and the municipalities, he was to support or distribute money to, or forget they existed. In the field of education, his notion was to privatize education and have little supervision of public education. He really didn't like the idea of the public. In spite of this populism and the treatment of the public, it's a kind of mixed picture, which is interesting in it. He had Moro in charge of the judicial system. He wanted to continue Lava Jato at the beginning and quickly end it because there were too many rich people who still had been involved, and he wanted to forget about them. In the Congress, he wanted more of the same, and he wanted the division of views to become quite uh, uh, rigid as alternatives. The final characteristic which he had, which was also characteristic of Trump, was that he's a liar. He says things that are not truthful and obviously not truthful. And he doesn't much care. It's not something that bothers him particularly as part of what goes on. So now we come to the present and we ask ourselves, what's going to happen in the future? It's a relevant question. And it comes at a time when the election in Brazil happens in less than a year. It happens next October. That you have an election of a new president, and that isn't clear. So I start off here saying, will it turn out to be Lula or Bolsonaro? Because all of the earlier projections show that the two of them have the largest degree of support. And the reason for that is Bolsonaro is doing everything he can to create a Brazil which looks favorable to the poorer class, which is part of his nationalism and populism. So long as they're quiet and on the side, he'll give them the scraps that they need, and that is fine. And Paulo Guedes, who earlier had started with all of these changes and privatizations and an attempt to restructure the government into smaller units, which now have doubled in size, creating more opportunities for the military to have ministerios that they're in control of. And he has suddenly discovered that he needs politicians, that he managed to elect a large number of politicians because they were in his party at the time of the last federal election. So the Congress has a large number of these. And what he's doing is dealing now with changing all of the budgetary rules. Brazil managed to create a set of policies which limited rise in governmental expenditures to a simple formula where you would increase the total expenditures that were available as a function of the inflation rate in the previous year, that would set a limit on what the budget for next year could be. What happened, of course, in the midst of this was a very large supplementary budget that first went into effect in 2020 and 2021 with the problems that came from COVID-19. That created a special condition which the Brazil Constitution allowed to be interpreted as a special circumstance allowing for larger expenditures. And now again, it's been created, and it's been created in order to finance the program of help that he is making available to the poor under the program that was called Bolsa Familia, which now has been eliminated, and Auxílio Brasil is now present, and there's going to be a larger number of people who will be there for their piece of the action. So that's what it's going to be like. Meanwhile, everyone else in Brazil, the 25% or more of the people who voted for Bolsonaro now say they will not vote for him. So people are looking for a third party candidate who magically will be able to gain a larger amount of support. And it looks pretty difficult. Moro has just come in, and he is now trying, as a result of having a previous reputation because of the extent to which Lava Jato, which means water hose, which relates to the place where the original idea of taking the money occurred. And Ciro Gomes, who's been a candidate for president since the 1970s, he has tried to change his party affiliation and the like. There's Governor Doria of Sao Paulo, and a number of others. But look at what the polls show. The polls show that Lula has the large majority. Lula in a first round winds up with 45% or something of that order. Bolsonaro winds up with something of the order of 23% or something of that sort. And the center exists in Brazil, but doesn't really. Because one of the things that is obvious is Lula cannot continue a fiscal policy that will be consistent with a low rate of inflation. And the reason for that is, by necessity, he will have to raise wages more. And as wages go up, prices have a tendency to increase as well. And that is clear. And Bolsonaro seems to have the same kind of economics in mind. He has a game that somehow he's going to replace this, but he's always suggesting somehow or another that there may be illegalities in the voting system that will create an unfair advantage for Lula and the PT. And under those conditions, he may try to play Trump. He's got a historical example he can follow. People are cheating. People aren't doing the right thing. We saw that he could manage to get people in Georgia, in which he had a conversation with the director of the authorization of the votes, saying all he needed was something like 13,000 votes, which could easily be arranged by canceling out those votes as having been presented illegally. And this attempt was made in Wisconsin. This attempt was also made in Michigan, which would have changed the results of the election. So that's number one. What happens to the economy? what happens to the economy is kind of very sad. Every week now, you see the projections for economic growth that are made by a variety of investment bankers and other bankers and published, is going down. It had been suggested that it was going to easily be 5.4 for the year. And the last numbers that have come in suggest that it's now down below 5 and approaching 4.8. And those results are because in the third quarter of this year, the results did not come in very well. They showed less growth than had been anticipated. And the reason for that is that it's the same problem that we've seen all along. Private investment doesn't exist. The only thing that exists is construction. Construction exists because it has ways and means for those doing construction to gain a little bit extra on the side. You have various ways and means of doing things with public construction, as it was the case with the Olympics and the World Cup in soccer. It's the case now, and I'll go into this a little bit more later. You have suddenly a bank, the central bank, which has been given constitutional freedom. In Brazil, unlike other countries, the central bank did not have the authority to determine the interest rate. The interest rate ultimately could be determined by the president. And the central bank in Brazil is desperately trying to deal with this inflation problem and the lack of confidence in Brazil. The central bank has raised the interest rates rapidly. They were at a point where negative interest rates were characteristic of the central bank. They're now positive, and projections suggest that they will continue to raise interest rates, as they just recently did, by 150 points, a meeting without there being a way of changing that possibility. So you have only the possibility of foreign investment And what you see is that with all of the legal cases that have been brought, in which foreign firms have had to also pay up because of the illegalities, they're not so eager any longer to undertake the problem. And with low growth and high interest rates, what happens is that people with high salaries who have the money to invest and earn those high rates domestically will be able to rise, whereas the minimum wage will be stuck because of the financial plight of the government. The final point that I want to make is the environment. The issue of the environment is central in the case of Brazil. The problem is the fires in the Amazon. And the fires in the Amazon in the last couple of years have been very substantial. The fires have occurred because land is being prepared for cattle. Brazil is a major meat exporter. And unlike chickens, you can manage to keep them cooped up in a chicken coop. But you can't do that with cattle, who require feed in order to be able to put on weight at the end. So when they are killed, they are heavier, and you can export it. You can use the soy beans that will create the possibility of doing now much more, given that Brazil no longer is an organic producer of soybeans, but rather uses GMO methods. The environment, interestingly, is something that neither Lula nor Bolsonaro care anything about. Neither of them have any interest. What they see is the working man who needs to have access to whatever is involved in connection with producing more electricity, in connection with making available whatever is needed. And environmental issues don't really count. And Bolsonaro, given his record in the last 2 years of serious increases in the degree of fire and allowing export of lumber that has been cut down in that area is now saying he accepts the notion of a 50% reduction of the contaminations that are characteristic of the present. So in that regard, both Bolsonaro and Lula are nationalists, populists, and little interest in cooperation, in freeing trade, in which there is a rationality that somehow gets created in the world system where you were able to do something. And the final thing I say is I'm still optimistic that history will not remake Brazil into a charter member of a large country that came close, but never somehow found the right path to sustained development. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Fischl. You just stopped the slides here. It's going to make it easier for us to discuss. One takeaway from Professor Fischl's presentation is that don't underestimate his crystal ball. But Professor Fischl, so 3 questions just to get the discussion started. One about past, and one about the present, and one the future. Brazil went through a last decade in the 80s, and now we were supposed to be finalizing another last decade until the pandemic hit. Can you do some parallels, like about what extent both crises are similar or different, and if you are more positive about the prospects now than you were towards the end of the 80s?
The reason I was more positive at the end of the 80s was the restoration of democracy. The fact that you were getting a major change in the quality of government, in which you were getting people who knew something as a way of justifying their position rather than knowing someone. And so I was positive, and I thought that the particular issues that had been laid out had a chance of being done, and that it wasn't the case that Brazil could not manage to make that transition. It was clear, after all, that they managed to sanction that is the problem of age. The guy who was not impeached but resigned, Kohler. Thank you. He came in with great plans to change matters in the 90s, and he managed to defeat the left, and he was about as incompetent then as he is now. He's a leading senator now and had been a major supporter of Lula. And it's not obvious to me that he won't manage to continue to go to Lula, because Alagoas is a state that is unlike many other in Brazil. It has few people, but the most important politicians in Brazil come from Alagoas, and they hate each other with a passion. And there have been cases reported in which individuals have been assassinated in Alagoas, one politician killing another, which is just par for the course. But the circumstance reflects a little bit this past history that was being changed. And it was changed in particular by the Plano Real, in which you now have a currency in the case of Brazil that has been functioning since 1994. And that comes down to close to 30 years that you've had a single currency in Brazil, which is a long, long time in comparison to the changes in the currency that happened at intervals of 6 months with rates of inflation that were extraordinary.
Perfect. So let's get questions from the students and talking about the current situation. Yes, Vanessa?
So I guess it's not particularly a question, but
You'll have to speak loudly because
can you hear me? Yeah.
I can
Okay.
hear you now,
Okay.
but you have to shout because
Can I take?
Yeah,
Yeah.
you can take the
Okay.
mask.
So I was wondering if you could talk more about how you framed, or I guess thought about, or what you think about the comparison between Trump and Bolsonaro, because I mean, I think it's very clear and I find it intriguing. So I wanted to see your thoughts on it, how you framed it. And
well, number one, neither of the two had ever held important political positions. It is true that Bolsonaro was 9 times elected from different parties, as a deputy in the Congress. But that was, he didn't do a thing in the Congress. I think his record of attendance actually was in negative numbers rather than positive numbers. So you have a similarity there. You have a similarity in terms of the families. Trump had his family, and his family was clearly the ones who understood everything. Jared, who never had a public position in his life, suddenly becomes the principal determinant of policies in the White House. His daughter, who makes a fortune selling perfume and I guess everything else that young ladies wear, maybe older ladies too. And it's exactly the same. Bolsonaro has his group of people who managed to get elected and take office. The families count more than the public policy in terms of the amount of time that is taken to assure that everything comes out all right. And the very large home that was bought in Brazil involving a very large sum of money that was, I think, made available by one of the public banks to his son is an indication of exactly the same sort of thing. Thirdly, each of them had mistaken hopes in the military. At least Bolsonaro had a military background, but which Trump never got into. Indeed, he avoided ever getting drafted in the case of Vietnam by indicating that he had a flat foot, and that would make him totally ineligible to have to be taken. And I think the person who, the doctor who gave that particular evaluation, which was passed along, got a big bonus as a consequence. There are always bonuses available for people who understand what they want to do. And finally, the lies. The fact that you no longer can believe what you read. The fact that you cannot depend upon someone's statement because it's obviously false, but it makes no difference so long as someone believes it. It's especially the case here with this woman who who's in the Congress, who is still trying to assure, what's the name of the group? There's a name to the group.
It's what?
It's not the Moonies.
QAnon. QAnon.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah, QAnon.
Yeah.
Uh,
QAnon.
And thank you. That just gets on and has programs, etc. This time, what is interesting is Bolsonaro wants to be sure that he has a party, and a party that will give him a large say in the congressional election, because his parties altogether will be the largest group, and therefore he will have the most time that is available to him so he can continue to lie. So in all of these respects, I think there's a remarkable difference, similarity rather, between the two of them. And what is so frightening in all of these occasions is the discovery that this still goes on.
So you mentioned, Professor Fishlow, that Bolsonaro and Lula find themselves sort of strangely on the same side of the economic question, both being in favor of raising the debt ceiling or the fiscal ceiling, like you said, and providing a new Auxilio Brazil. First of all, one, would you say that what is the reaction within Brazil, or your reaction to Bolsonaro suddenly like having this epiphany that he is a left-wing populist now and not a right-wing? Because comparing that with the goals that you stated were his campaign promises, that seems to be incongruous with those initial principles that he laid out. And two, does that kind of put Lula in a bind because he now finds Bolsonaro, almost to the left of him, if not right in lockstep? So maybe we've talked about in the past, Lula was a pragmatist when he was in office in the early 2000s. So does that does this new sudden Bolsonaro adoption of left-wing populism, does that kind of preclude any possibility for Lula to go in the pragmatic direction? Whereas, he might have done that if not for this.
Well, you'll notice that Lula conveniently is not in Brazil at the moment. Lula is visiting Europe. And one of the reasons he's doing that is he doesn't want to get tarred or blamed or involved in any way, shape, or form. And he had suggested Alckmin, the former governor of Sao Paulo, who has moved away from the PSDB because he doesn't get along with Doria, as the person he prefers for the vice presidency. So he would play that role for Lula, as Lula tries to make believe that this guy is really out of it. He doesn't know which side is up, as it were, and therefore he would prefer an establishment figure who for a long time, he had been a candidate for the presidency back in was 2006. Alckmin had been the candidate.
Yeah. So I read some analyses and arguments that suggest that Bolsonaro essentially, instead of seizing the maximum institutional power that he could, has instead been more interested in sort of attacking democratic social norms or informal democratic institutions, and that he has, to a certain degree, abdicated some responsibility at a governance level. And I was wondering to what extent you would agree with that assessment.
I'll ask you to repeat that again, please.
Sure. Well, so I've read some arguments that suggest that Bolsonaro basically, he had more potential to make more formal institutional change at a governance level, as in sort of rewriting laws or potentially like redrafting constitution or things like this. But he's instead been more interested in kind of like the Twitterverse and in deepening polarization and enhancing divides, while he could have kind of spent more time governing and changing policy. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on that argument or that assessment.
I think Bolsonaro is stupid and therefore has a total inability to understand any of the policies that Paulo Guedes is talking about.
Okay.
And he goes off and out. He's in away for a week now himself. He figures Lula's away, so he must have to go away too. And he's unable, and his kids tell him what to do.
Oh, okay. So you perceive him as more of a figurehead than anything else.
Yeah.
Okay, interesting.
One of the great things of having Professor Fischler here is that we don't have to operate under cat and house rules. Every discussion is open. Follow?
Yeah, Professor Fischler, my question is, so you mentioned you're an optimist about Brazil, but you also mentioned Argentina, which a century ago was one of the richest countries in the world, and now is very much not, and it's been struggling for a long time. So how is Brazil going to be different than Argentina? What makes Brazil, or can you explain, like, when looking at Argentina, how can you be optimistic about the path Brazil is on?
Well, the trouble is Brazil's not on a path. Brazil hasn't been able to define a path, hasn't been able to assure that a path that it wishes to follow will enable it to arrive in a particular place. Dilma, when she was inaugurated in 2012, or maybe it was even, it was 2012 or 2010. But whenever she, in an early speech, she pointed out that Brazil was going to have an anniversary right, in 2024, isn't it?
Two.
Next year.
Yes. And that by that time, the income per capita would have doubled. In reality, the income per capita in Brazil has not grown virtually at all since she made that speech.
Mm.
So this is the longest recession that Brazil has had. Brazil has had other periods of recession earlier on, but in many ways, they followed attempts to stabilize the very high inflation rates that came in with the formation of the First Republic, when you had no control over the price and the milhões. It disappeared as a currency, and you had a contention and slowdown in activity over that period of time. But on the whole, governments don't like to use policies that have negative effects. Every government sees a way out of a problem so that there may be a minor, temporary, little difficulty, but it's never going to last long, maybe 6 months or something of that kind. And then we'll be growing again. That's what they're saying now is necessary to convince the American people, because otherwise they're going to vote for all these Republicans who don't believe in the electoral system. I guess I think that what's troubling to me is if you don't get it right the first time, it's all right. But when you keep not getting it right, maybe with one more attempt that Lula makes, where people tell him that he should let this go and that go. And there are people in Brazil who will argue for this policy, people in the PT. You may wind up there. So I am frightened. You know, Argentina currently has an inflation rate of 55.7% a year.
We have a question from this side. Yeah, Veronica?
Hi, you mentioned briefly, this, potential problem with like I forgot how you worded it, was like the middle class. And that got me thinking about like the new generation that's starting to go to school and work in Brazil. So I'm curious if there is a problem of this talent moving out of Brazil, migrating, immigrating to wherever else they want. I know that's a problem, particularly now in like in Eastern Europe, but also it's happened to many other countries. So I'm just curious if that is anything that's pertinent to this or for this.
Well, there's been more out migration from Brazil in the last couple of years than had been the case previously. And that is rare. And people who are employed in international agencies, instead of going back to the agencies in Brazil from which they were originally here, find other things to do and manage to get extra time and don't get paid. But there is a sense that if Bolsonaro were reelected, or even worse, were Bolsonaro to take on the system and get more of the military involved, I think you would get many more Brazilians who would leave, just the way so many left in the case of Chile.
Yeah, definitely. That's a good question, because what we're seeing is somehow a brain drain. Brazil never had this kind of problem because Brazilians who used to go abroad, they always tend to go back, unlike what happens in other countries. But we're starting to see also high net worth individuals that have been transferring part of their assets abroad because of the reasons that our professional outlined. So we have questions from this side. Yeah, is there?
I don't know if anyone. So, Professor, thank you for being here. It's a great pleasure to listen to you in person. So it could be a silly question, but what made you fall in love with Brazil? I'm asking this because as a Brazilian, sometimes we have the feeling that there is an ongoing sensation that Brazil will take off, but unfortunately it never happened, it never occurred. So what is your reason to keep living in our country?
Well, I like Brazil from the first time I went there. And I somehow or another found people of high quality, interesting intellectuals who you could discuss things with that weren't just technical matters, but you could discuss politics with, that you could discuss culture with, that you could manage to have an interrelationship with that was different in character from the relationship in Argentina, where everybody had their own psychiatrist. It turns out that there are more psychiatrists in Buenos Aires than there are people working in manufacturing. And I especially enjoyed teaching there, which in principle I wasn't supposed to do. And I taught at the Fundação Getúlio Vargas, and indeed some of the people who were my students then now have positions in the government. And those friendships are what count. And when I was teaching at the University of California, I had 23 Brazilian students who got PhDs. Which was a substantial record. And we used to meet once a week at my house. And it was just a very pleasant kind of experience that I've never found replicated in other countries. And I've been, I think, virtually to every country in South America, some official, and many of the countries in Central America as well as Mexico. So that's the reason. And I always give the excuse that I speak Portuguese. And therefore, I can't really go to a Spanish-speaking country because it gets all confusing.
The unofficial story that I heard directly from Professor Fischler in previous years is that he was a soccer player. Professor Fischler, I know that you don't like to brag about your sports accomplishments. Right, so I have a question. Yeah, Joseph.
Thanks, Professor Fischler, for talking with us today.
I also played soccer in Brazil, actually, with my students. And by that time, it was the 1st of January, which explains why I would do it, and explains why they would be there. We had a big party at my house, and I think I had had a little too much to consume, but and there I was, and then they scored goal after goal, and it was like inflation. It was something I just couldn't deal with.
So I'm interested in this idea of kind of bonos as either this tool to help bring people out of poverty or into kind of a middle class situation. On the other hand, bonos bonos in general can also be used as like a populist tool to buy votes. Thinking about what Fernandez is doing right now in Argentina prior to the midterms and very recently. You just mentioned that Bolsa Familiar was a success in Brazil, and I'm curious to hear you speak more about the difference between these bonos, also a success under Evo Morales in Bolivia, I believe, when they can be successful, when they are more of a tool for vote buying, and feel free to answer generally or with also bringing in kind of the Bolsa Familiar example.
Yes, Well, the trick with Bolsa Familia was moving from a system in which you had a variety of programs that provided help, such as medical help, such as food subsidies. What Bolsa Familia started from was a program in education in which children got money for attending school on a regular basis. And the parents got money to help support the kids instead of having them work. And that was quite important. And was one of the reasons for the success of the program. The difficulty is in deciding how people would receive the money. And the government was very efficient in that regard. People had a card which indicated their fact they were receiving money, and they would be able to deposit it at the bank and receive the money, all of the money, and it was done in a fairly serious fashion. And it managed to operate. But there you have a regional problem. And the regional problem is non-trivial. The poorest people evident. The problems with the program are they easily become corrupt. Wrong people get selected to become members and are able to get the benefits. That people who should be getting the benefit don't get the benefit because the local party member tells someone not to bother with them because they're part of the PSDB rather than the PT. But on the whole, the program expanded quite favorably. And the thing that was special about Bolsa Familia was this medical assistance, and particularly in treatment of pregnancy. And if you look at the numbers on the number of pregnant children, the number of pregnant women whose children were lost, what you find very quickly is that those that were on Bolsa Familia versus those who were not did much better. And that was a major gain that was part of the program that doesn't get the same kind of attention that it should. I am a little worried, quite frankly, that Auxílio Brasil which has a whole group of new people, and probably military people for all that I know, that will suddenly wind up making these decisions just as they were making it in public health. It's kind of scary under the circumstances. And the same way they ended the Minha Casa Minha Vida, although it had its limitations and difficulties, at least some people did get better housing than they had available to them in areas that were not totally distant from the urban center where commercial activity provided the jobs.
Professor, so we have a few minutes to conclude this class, and we always dedicate some time to talk about professional development. And Professor Fischel, of course, he developed his career mostly in academia, but it's also worth mentioning that he was with the State Department and Deputy Assistant Secretary, and he spent even some time in Wall Street. And Professor Fischel, for the students here, and most of them are not going to be following academic careers, what would you recommend as part of their general professional development prospects, and what would you suggest as in which ways studying Brazil can be part of their future careers?
Well, one of the things that is interesting about Brazil is the large number of NGOs that exist. Brazil is very special in this regard. The number of NGOs that is to say non-governmental, that they gain contracts from the government in order to do projects in one or another areas. They generally like people whose views at a young age are more likely to be open to new ideas and new ways and methods of doing things compared to those who create bureaucracies. The trick in a Brazil is that you have bureaucracy deeply embedded in the system. You have it quite deeply embedded in the system. And therefore, managing it is quite a problem, and being able to make a choice. So that's one thing. A second place that is actually quite good are banks in the physical system. In a way, it's a job not to be a teller, but jobs involving research. The banks in Brazil are basically large research undertakings. The Bank of Brazil and others, all Caixa Econômica, all have associated and affiliated agencies and the like. So that's another possibility where what is involved is not necessarily your idea of dealing individually with people, because what they use are the machines. And no one is handing out the money to them. So that's a second possibility. A third possibility, and this is again relevant, is going on for a PhD. And in Brazil, institutions that offer PhDs there are many, and many are in the public sector, and many, as a result, are relatively free, as opposed to the programs that are private, which charge a fair amount to students by contrast. So I would indicate that as a possibility.
Thank you, Professor. And very briefly, some research topics for our students who are going to be continuing to study in Brazil next semester.
Well, there's a lot of research that is in fact necessary at the municipal level. That the municipal level in Brazil spends a lot of money relative to money that is spent by municipalities elsewhere. And they have NGOs and an ability to respond simply because some of them have set up cooperative arrangements, for example, in allocation of municipal programs of welfare that are available. Some of them make available loans to individuals with lower levels of income. So I think that your focus ought to be on a municipality where you know someone, because that's how you'll get a job. Undertaking this kind of project that may turn out to be significant.
Professor Fischler, it's been an honor and great pleasure to have you back in the classroom. Thanks so much for audience who has been with us on YouTube throughout the semester. We'll be back in January with a new assembly of this course. So Anna, thanks so much for helping us also throughout our class.